The unexpected discovery. Juan had spent most of his 70 years tending to his small farm nestled at the foot of the mountains, a place where the mornings were quiet and the world seemed to move at a gentle, predictable pace. His life had always been one of routine, waking up with the sun, tending to his crops, feeding the animals, and spending the evenings with Maria, his wife of many years. The farm was humble, but it was their sanctuary, a place they had built together. It was still early that morning when Juan stepped out of his small cottage, his weathered hands clutching his old straw hat. The cool mist that hung in the air was beginning to lift, revealing the outlines of the fields and the towering mountains that guarded their farm like silent sentinels. Estrella, his loyal dog, trotted beside him, her bright eyes alert as always. She was a mixed breed, scrappy and resilient, just like Juan. They'd spent years together, the dog always by his side, the two of them sharing the solitude of the land. As Juan moved towards the barn, Estrella suddenly began to bark. It was a sound unlike any Juan had heard before. Urgent, anxious, almost frantic. He stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion, and looked at the dog. Estrella, normally calm and composed, was pacing back and forth, her ears perked up as if she sensed something unusual. Juan squinted towards the edge of the property, where the small forest bordered his land. A faint rustle came from the thicket, a soft sound that could have been mistaken for wind. Yet it was something more. "What's wrong, girl?" Juan asked in his gravelly voice, his gaze following Estrella's frantic movements. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the forest. There was something unsettling about the morning. Something offbeat, like the world was waiting for something to happen. Estrella barked again and darted toward the edge of the woods. Without thinking, Juan followed her, his boots crunching through the leaves as he made his way toward the dense underbrush. The air seemed to grow colder, and the once familiar forest now felt foreign, its shadows deeper and more foreboding than usual. As they ventured farther into the woods, the quiet seemed to envelop them. The only sound was the rustling of leaves beneath their feet and Estrella's sharp, anxious barks. She led him through the trees until they reached a small clearing. There, amidst the dry brown leaves that had fallen from the trees, Juan saw something that made his heart stop. 3 small figures were lying together in the middle of the clearing. 3 babies, wrapped in tattered blankets, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold morning air. The shock of the sight rooted Juan to the spot for a moment, as his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He rushed forward, his heart racing, his hands trembling. Estrella, who had been sniffing around the babies, looked up at him with eyes full of urgency, as if urging him to act. Juan fell to his knees beside them, his rough hands gently brushing aside the leaves. He could see the fragile, newborn faces, 2 girls and a boy, their skin pale from the cold, their small mouths slightly parted as they breathed shallowly. His breath caught in his throat as he checked to make sure they were still alive. He could feel the faint pulse of life in their tiny chests. His mind was spinning. Who would leave 3 babies here, in the middle of the forest, abandoned and vulnerable? His first instinct was to search the surrounding area, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, no hint of who could have left them behind. It was as if they had simply appeared, like a cruel twist of fate. "Estrella," he murmured, his voice shaky. "What in the world is happening?" The dog stood still by his side, her eyes locked on the babies, watching them carefully as if she knew they were in danger. Juan didn't hesitate. He wrapped the 3 babies carefully in his old poncho, cradling them against his chest as he stood. He didn't understand what had happened, why they had been abandoned, but there was no question in his mind. He couldn't leave them here. With the babies bundled safely in his arms, Juan stood and looked around once more. He felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. The forest, once so familiar, now felt like a strange and unfathomable place. He knew he needed to act quickly to get the children to safety. Without wasting another second, he turned and began walking back toward the farm, Estrella following closely behind. His thoughts were in a whirlwind. Who could do this to children so small, so innocent? How had they come to be left alone in the woods like this? His heart ached as he thought about the lives they had been denied, the future that had been stolen from them. As he neared the edge of the woods, the warmth of the morning sun broke through the trees, casting a golden glow on the path before him. The familiar sight of his farm came into view, but it felt different now. It felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand, something that would change everything. When Juan reached the house, Maria, his wife, was waiting by the door, her eyes soft but concerned. She had always been able to sense when something was wrong. "What's happened, Juan? You look so pale," she said, her voice filled with worry. But her gaze quickly fell to the bundle in his arms, and her concern deepened. "Juan, what is that?" "Maria," Juan began, his voice trembling slightly, "you won't believe what I found." He carefully stepped inside, placing the babies gently on the wooden table. Maria, her brow furrowing in confusion, hurried to his side. She gasped when she saw the babies, so small, so fragile, and immediately moved toward them, her hands shaking with disbelief. "Oh my God, Juan," she whispered, covering her mouth in shock. "Where did they come from?" Juan could only shake his head. "I don't know. They were in the forest, abandoned. Estrella found them." Maria didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at the babies, her eyes filled with a mix of horror and compassion. Her hands moved quickly, as if she instinctively knew what to do. She grabbed blankets from a nearby shelf, wrapping the children in warmth and comfort. She found some milk from breakfast and began feeding one of the babies with a spoon, her face filled with a quiet determination. Juan, still in shock, stoked the fire in the stove to warm up the house. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had lived his entire life on the farm, a life of simplicity and routine, but now everything had changed. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a caretaker, a protector, of 3 tiny lives that had been abandoned by the world. "We can't just leave them here, Juan," Maria said, her voice filled with a kind of quiet strength. "We have to take care of them. We can't ignore them." Juan nodded silently, sitting down at the table and clasping his hands together. He knew Maria was right, but the enormity of the responsibility weighed heavily on him. Later that night, as the babies slept, the farm was filled with a new energy. The familiar silence of the night was interrupted by the soft whimpers and tiny cries of the children, their need for comfort and care filling every corner of the house. Maria and Juan, though exhausted from the day, took turns holding the babies, trying to soothe them with lullabies and whispered reassurances. But in the quiet of the night, as Juan sat by the fire, his thoughts were heavy with unanswered questions. What was going to happen to these children? What had led them to be left alone in the woods, and how would their lives change from this point on? As the fire crackled and the children slept, Juan knew one thing for certain. His life had already changed forever. The weight of responsibility. The morning light broke softly over the hills, casting long shadows across Juan's small farm. It was a typical morning in the countryside, quiet and peaceful, with only the sounds of birds chirping and the wind rustling through the trees. But today, everything felt different. There was a heavy weight in the air, an unspoken shift that neither Juan nor Maria could ignore. Juan woke early, as he always did, to begin his daily chores. Estrella was already by his side, the dog's bright eyes alert as always. But today, even she seemed a bit out of sorts. The familiar rhythm of the morning, feeding the animals, checking the fields, felt strangely out of place. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the 3 babies they had found the day before. Their tiny faces, so innocent and fragile, kept appearing in his mind. He had never imagined his life would be so profoundly changed in an instant. Maria had been up even earlier than him, preparing the morning broth and cleaning up after the babies. Juan could hear her soft footsteps as she moved through the house, the sounds of pots clinking and quiet murmurs to the children as she tried to calm their restless cries. They hadn't slept much, not after the events of the previous day. The weight of the decision they had made the night before, taking responsibility for these children, hung heavy on both of them. Maria met him in the kitchen, her face tired but determined. She had always been the stronger of the two, the one who faced challenges head-on with an unwavering resolve. But now, even she seemed uncertain. As she stirred the broth, she glanced up at him. "Juan," she said, her voice quiet, "we can't keep doing this on our own. I know you feel it too. We're not equipped to care for them. We don't have enough to share. This is too much." Juan stopped in his tracks, his hands tightening on the wooden spoon in his grip. He knew Maria was right. Their farm was small, and what little they'd harvested barely covered their own needs. How could they feed 3 more mouths? How could they provide for them when their resources were so limited? "I know, Maria," Juan said, his voice heavy with the same doubts that had been plaguing him since the moment he found the babies. "But what else can we do? I can't just leave them. I can't ignore what we found. They're here now, and we have to help them." Maria looked at him with a mixture of love and concern. She understood his heart, his deep sense of duty, but she also understood the realities of their life. "Juan, we're getting old. We've lived a life of hard work, and it hasn't always been easy. But we can't give what we don't have. I'm worried about them. About us." Juan's mind was racing. He couldn't deny that the situation was overwhelming. But something inside him, something he couldn't quite explain, refused to let him turn away. These babies had been abandoned, left alone in the woods with no one to care for them. And now, by some twist of fate, they were here with him and Maria. He couldn't just turn his back on them. "I know," he said, his voice softening, "but we can't just give up on them. Not now. We have to find a way." Maria sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. She moved to the table where the babies were resting, wrapped in blankets and resting under the warmth of the fire. The sight of them, so small, so vulnerable, stirred something deep within her. She had always been a practical woman, but even she could not ignore the pull of maternal instinct that surged through her when she looked at the children. "They're so young," she whispered. "Who would leave them like that? Who could do such a thing?" Juan didn't answer. He didn't have the answers to those questions. But the sadness and the uncertainty in Maria's voice touched him deeply. They had always taken care of each other, but now they were faced with a responsibility they had never imagined. He moved to stand beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." Maria turned to face him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "You're right, Juan. We will. But we need help. We can't do this alone." The conversation lingered between them, unspoken and heavy, as they both tried to come to terms with the enormity of what lay ahead. But they knew they couldn't make this decision in isolation. They had to seek guidance, and there was one person they both trusted above all others: Father Pedro. Father Pedro was the parish priest in the nearby village, a wise and compassionate man who had guided the people of the town through many difficult times. He had always been a source of comfort and clarity for Juan and Maria, a man who spoke with the wisdom of years and the understanding of the human heart. They knew that if anyone could help them make sense of this situation, it was Father Pedro. After breakfast, Juan and Maria bundled up the babies in blankets and carefully placed them in an old wooden cart, the same cart they used for transporting their crops. They set off down the road, the wheels creaking as they rolled over the uneven terrain. Estrella followed closely behind, her gaze watchful, as if she understood the importance of the journey. The road to the village was long, but it gave Juan and Maria time to think and reflect. They passed fields of golden hay and rows of crops that Juan had tended to for years. The land, though humble, had always been a source of pride for him. But today the field seemed to blur in his vision, his thoughts consumed by the babies resting in the cart. They were so small, so fragile. What would happen to them? Could he and Maria truly be the ones to raise them, to give them the life they deserved? As they neared the village, the familiar sight of St. Michael's Church appeared on the horizon. The stone building, sturdy and weathered by time, stood tall and proud amidst the surrounding homes. The church had been a cornerstone of their community for generations, a place of solace and guidance. Father Pedro was waiting outside, as he often did in the mornings, greeting parishioners as they came and went. His calm demeanor and warm smile were always a comfort, and today, more than ever, Juan and Maria were grateful for his presence. Juan, Maria, Father Pedro greeted them with a smile. "What brings you here so early today?" Juan stepped forward, the weight of the cart pulling at his heart. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Father Pedro's with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "Father," Juan said, his voice trembling slightly, "we found something we can't ignore." Father Pedro's brow furrowed in concern as he looked at the cart. His expression softened as he stepped closer and peered inside. The moment his eyes fell on the three babies, his face took on an expression of shock and then profound sadness. "My God," he whispered, his voice full of compassion. "Where did you find them?" "In the forest," Maria said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "They were abandoned there, left alone. We couldn't just leave them." Father Pedro placed a hand on Juan's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You've done the right thing, bringing them here. These children deserve love and care, and you both have the hearts to provide that. But we need to be careful. We need to know where they came from, and we need to make sure they are safe." Juan nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. Father Pedro's words, though calm and measured, gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. "We didn't know what to do," Juan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We're old. We don't have much, but we couldn't leave them to fate." Father Pedro smiled gently. "No, you couldn't, and I'm proud of you both for that. Let's take them inside. We'll figure this out together." As Father Pedro led them into the church, Juan and Maria felt the weight lift off their shoulders. For the first time since they had found the babies, they felt a sense of clarity. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The unanswered questions. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty. The familiar rhythm of farm life, once so predictable and comforting, now seemed to carry a weight that Juan and Maria could no longer ignore. The babies, although only a few days old, had become the center of their world, and everything else, the crops, the animals, the daily chores, seemed to pale in comparison. They had made the decision to care for the children, but now the reality of that decision was setting in. What did it truly mean to raise these children? What did they need, and how would they provide for them? Maria had taken the lead in caring for the babies, as she always had with anything that came her way. She cooked, cleaned, and fed the children with the gentleness only a mother could possess. But as each day passed, a new wave of worry washed over her. They were both getting older, and their small farm, though a haven for the two of them, wasn't equipped for the responsibility of 3 helpless infants. Juan, too, felt the weight of the decision. Every time he looked at the babies, so small, so innocent, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He was grateful they were alive, grateful for the second chance they had been given, but he still had so many questions. Why were they abandoned? Who would leave babies like this, alone in the woods? And why had Estrella, his loyal dog, found them in the first place? He walked the fields alone one morning, his boots crunching through the dirt as he tried to clear his mind. The farm was quiet, just as it always had been, but now the silence felt heavier. His thoughts drifted to the village and the possibility of finding answers. He and Maria had been hesitant to involve the authorities, unsure of what they might discover. But as the days went on, they realized they couldn't just keep the babies hidden away on their farm. They needed help, someone who could help them understand what had happened. The early morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground as Juan wandered toward the village church. He had visited Father Pedro every Sunday for years, but today he felt the need to talk to him again, to ask questions, to seek guidance. Maria had suggested they talk to the local police, but Juan wasn't sure where to begin. The babies had no identity, no names, no history. There was nothing to link them to the world beyond the forest where they had been abandoned. Father Pedro greeted Juan warmly when he arrived at the church, his calm demeanor and kind eyes always a source of comfort for the old man. Juan had known him for years, ever since he and Maria had settled on the farm, and he trusted the priest's judgment more than anyone else. Today, however, the weight of his questions was heavier than ever. "Father," Juan began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need your help." Father Pedro motioned for him to sit down on one of the wooden pews, the cool stone floor beneath them a stark contrast to the warmth of the small chapel. The air smelled of incense and old wood, the quiet stillness of the place offering a sense of peace that Juan desperately needed. "What troubles you, Juan?" Father Pedro asked gently, his voice always a calming presence. Juan sat, his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the floor. "It's the babies. I don't know what to do. We took them in. We couldn't just leave them. But Maria and we're getting old. We don't have much to give. I feel like I've done something right, but at the same time, I'm afraid. What happens next? What will the village say?" Father Pedro listened carefully, his eyes never leaving Juan's face. He understood the weight of his words. The village was small, and word would spread quickly. There was always a certain suspicion around things that didn't fit within the usual order of life. But Father Pedro knew that the greatest gift one could offer in such a situation was compassion. "You've done a good thing, Juan," he said softly. "Caring for those children is a noble act. Not everyone would have done as you and Maria have, but I can understand your fears. The road ahead is uncertain, and the world will question why these babies were abandoned. It's not easy to raise children, especially when you don't know where they've come from or what their future holds." Juan nodded, his brow furrowed. "Exactly. That's why I came to you, Father. I need to know what to do. We can't keep them hidden forever. The authorities will eventually find out. But what if? What if they take them away from us? What if they think we did something wrong?" Father Pedro's gaze softened. "You're not alone in this, Juan. There are always people who will help, but you must be honest about everything you know. And that begins with finding out more about these children. You don't know where they came from, but we can try to uncover that. You can't take on this burden by yourself." Juan sat in silence for a moment, the priest's words sinking in. He knew that Father Pedro was right. He couldn't do this alone. The weight of raising 3 babies without any support was too much for him and Maria to bear. And though the idea of involving the authorities scared him, it was clear that they couldn't keep the children hidden forever. They needed to know the truth. "But how?" Juan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we find out where they came from?" Father Pedro stood and walked over to a small table by the altar, where a stack of old papers and records lay. "There are always ways," he said with a smile, as if he had known all along this day would come. He picked up a piece of paper and handed it to Juan. "I'll speak to the local authorities. I'll make sure that everything is handled properly. And in the meantime, we will care for them. We'll protect them, as we should. But we must also uncover the truth. These children deserve that." Juan felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time since he had found the babies, he felt like there was a path forward. Father Pedro would help. He would make sure that everything was done right. It wasn't just about raising the children. It was about understanding where they had come from and giving them the best chance at life. "I don't know what to say, Father," Juan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. We're just 2 old people. I never thought our lives would be turned upside down like this, but I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." Father Pedro placed a reassuring hand on Juan's shoulder. "You've already done more than many would, Juan. You've given them the most important thing of all, love. As Juan left the church, the burden of uncertainty seemed lighter. He still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. With Father Pedro's help, they would find out the truth about the babies. And then, together, they would figure out what to do next. The road ahead was still unknown, but Juan knew one thing for sure. He and Maria were no longer alone in this. And no matter where this journey led, they would face it together, with love, courage, and the unwavering support of those who cared. A new beginning. The following weeks were a blur of uncertainty and hope as Juan and Maria, with the help of Father Pedro, began their search for answers. The village was small, and news traveled fast. The two of them had been hesitant at first to share the truth of the baby's discovery with the authorities, but Father Pedro had insisted. The priest's wisdom and calm reassurances had been the beacon they needed to guide them through the storm. Despite their fears, the authorities had been nothing but kind. There were many questions to answer and many unknowns to uncover, but the village police were understanding. They didn't look at Juan and Maria with suspicion. They saw them as two elderly people trying to do the right thing, struggling to care for three vulnerable children who had been abandoned in the woods. It wasn't the first time the village had seen hardship, and it wasn't the first time the community had banded together to offer support when it was most needed. After weeks of careful investigation, a breakthrough came. Father Pedro had reached out to various local authorities and social workers, seeking any record or knowledge of the children. It was an old town filled with long memories and close-knit families, and it was inevitable that someone would know something. And so it happened. The children had not been abandoned by strangers, as Juan had feared. They were the grandchildren of a family from a neighboring village, whose lives had been turned upside down by tragedy. Their parents had perished in an accident years before, and the family had struggled in silence to keep the children safe, eventually deciding to send them to a distant relative. But somehow, in the confusion of life's circumstances, the children had gotten lost in the shuffle, left forgotten and abandoned on the edge of the forest. The discovery was both a relief and a heartbreak. The children, though abandoned in the woods, had not been forgotten by their bloodline, and there was a family out there who would want them. Maria and Juan had prepared themselves for any outcome, but the knowledge that the children had ties to a family, people who would want them, people who could offer them a life they deserved, was bittersweet. One bright morning, after much deliberation, Juan and Maria made their way to the local authorities to meet with the children's family. The meeting was to take place in the small village hall, a simple stone building where many a life had been celebrated and mourned. It was a place of beginnings and endings, of answers and questions. It seemed fitting that it would be the setting for the children's next chapter. Juan and Maria arrived early, their hearts heavy with a mix of emotions. The babies, now a little older and more alert, were nestled in the blankets that Maria had carefully prepared. Estrella, ever faithful, sat beside them, watching over the children with the quiet protectiveness that only a dog could have. As they walked into the village hall, they were greeted by a family they did not recognize at first. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to hold years of pain, stood at the front. He was flanked by an older woman, his mother, and a younger woman who looked to be in her late 20s. She was cradling one of the babies in her arms, her expression a mixture of love and loss. "Juan, Maria," the man said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I am Raphael. These are my children, my mother, and my sister. We don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Juan nodded, his throat tight. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say, but the words didn't seem enough. "We didn't do it alone," he said, his voice cracking. "Father Pedro helped us, and the authorities. Well, they were kind to us." Raphael nodded solemnly. "We've been through so much. The loss of my brother and sister-in-law, it nearly destroyed us. My parents, my sister, and I have been trying to put the pieces back together. And when we heard about the babies, I didn't know what to think." can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is better, she said with quiet strength. Raphael nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. Thank you both. For everything. As the meeting came to an end, Juan and Maria stood in the village hall, their hearts heavy but full. They had given up the children, yes, but they had given them something far greater, hope. They had given them the opportunity to live and to love. And in turn, they had found something for themselves. A renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the power of compassion and the deep bonds that connect us all. As Juan and Maria left the hall, Estrella at their heels, they looked toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the fields. The farm was quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet, one filled with memories of the children they had cared for. And as they walked back to their home, hand in hand, Juan knew one thing for sure. Life, though unpredictable and often difficult, always had a way of surprising them. They had lived a simple life, but they had lived it with love. And that was all that mattered. Maria smiled gently, her heart breaking as she watched Raphael's mother hold the babies in her arms. We understand, she said. They're a gift, you know. They've changed our lives in ways we never imagined. The room fell silent for a moment, as everyone took in the weight of the moment. The moment when these children, who had been abandoned and left alone in the forest, were finally reunited with their family. The babies, no longer just orphaned souls lost to the world, now had a home. They had a family. They had a future. I'm sorry it had to be this way, Raphael said quietly. But I promise you, I will give them everything I can. I will raise them right. I won't let them feel abandoned again. Juan's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the children. His heart ached, knowing they were leaving, knowing that the little family he and Maria had built around them was coming to an end. But he also felt something else. Pride. They had done something that most wouldn't have. They had given these children love, care, and the opportunity to find their place in the world. I believe you, Juan said, his voice steady. I believe you'll be good to them. Maria, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward and took Raphael's hand. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is better, she said with quiet strength. Raphael nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. Thank you both. For everything. As the meeting came to an end, Juan and Maria stood in the village hall, their hearts heavy but full. They had given up the children, yes, but they had given them something far greater, hope. They had given them the opportunity to live and to love. And in turn, they had found something for themselves. A renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the power of compassion and the deep bonds that connect us all. As Juan and Maria left the hall, Estrella at their heels, they looked toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the fields. The farm was quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet, one filled with memories of the children they had cared for. And as they walked back to their home, hand in hand, Juan knew one thing for sure. Life, though unpredictable and often difficult, always had a way of surprising them. They had lived a simple life, but they had lived it with love. And that was all that mattered. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.